Good evening, everybody. I'm glad you could be here. My name is Peter Ward. I'm the director of the library, and welcome to Author Author. Author Author is a program that the library sponsors to assist local authors in getting their work out to the public. And tonight's author is Al Campo, lifelong Lindenhurst resident, Lindy High School graduate, just like me. And Al wrote his first novel, A Funny Thing About War, which he'll be talking about tonight, historical fiction. And Al is a retired mortgage banking executive of 30 years and a Vietnam War veteran. And before entering the Navy and starting his career in business, he attended the universities of Missouri and Hofstra. Nowadays, according to the blurb from his publisher, when he isn't tending to his gardens or riding his Harley, he's plying his Navy skills to tying fish knots on his boat and the Moody Blues along the southern shore of Long Island. The Funny Thing About War is Al's first novel, and Al will be available to sign copies of his book for anybody that... It's my great pleasure to introduce Al Campo.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. Thank you, Peter. Like everyone said, like Peter said, my name is Al Campo. I'm a graduate of Lindenhurst High School, 1968. Following that, I went to University of Missouri, and after the University of Missouri, ended up in the service, drafted into the Navy. Spent 2 years aboard the USS Lawrence, DDG-4. This book is a recount of my first 6 months on board. It depicts the Westpac deployment of the ship from June 72 to December 72. Ben Franklin said, before departing this life, you should write something worth reading or do something worth writing about. I think in doing this book, I've achieved both of those goals. My experience and adventures with the Navy in Vietnam in a rather unique location and part of the world, such as the Philippines, the Hong Kong, Taiwan, off the North Vietnamese coast, involved in battle, involved in some pretty lascivious activities at some of the one of the Liberty ports called Olongapo, Philippines. It was an everything goes Liberty town. In fact, my original concept was to write a book that focused on sailors and the lunacy they engaged in while they were on shore during their liberty. Ultimately, I found another book written by a guy named Robert Leininger called Olongapo Liberty, which is exactly what the book that I intended to write. But I had reconsidered and thought about the efforts that were put forth by the soldiers that were in country and all of the other veterans that served there. There were over 3 million military personnel served in the Vietnam War, 2 million of which were sailors. We all know 56,000 perished in that war. 2,000 of those happened to be sailors as well. So I wanted to honor them and also be true to the story and the efforts put forth by the crew. So in essence, the story is kind of a historical memoir of mine. It followed my path early in life. I was having left college and going to school and bumming around for nearly a year and a half, 2 years, and not knowing where I was going, kind of falling into kind of a pit of self-pity. Ultimately, I came to a conclusion that I had to get the heck out of this town because it was insane. Simultaneously, I received word from the Navy that said that I was obligated to spend 2 years of active duty in exchange for the time that they paid for my college scholarship for ROTC. Without any other plan and desperate to get out of here, I opted to accept the scholarship. Ended up reporting to the Brooklyn Navy Yard. They gave me 10 days travel time and to go to Travis Air Force Base in San Francisco. I spent some time out in California visiting some friends. Took a bus up to San Francisco. Next thing was a 17-hour plane ride to Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. From there, I ended up reporting to the ship. And in essence, this book, The Funny Thing About War, is a replay of everything I just told you in pretty good, in a lot of detail. There's some humor and there's some not so funny stuff going on there. Now, I did some research for this book. This occurred in my life over 40 years ago, so my memory was a little bit sketchy at best. So I I contacted a vet rep and asked him if he could give me some help obtaining my ship's records from the Naval Archives. And this is kind of a side story, but he gave me he told me he couldn't help me there, but he could help me get Agent Orange benefits. I said, well, I was on board ship. We were never really closer than 600 yards from the beach. And he said, it doesn't matter, it was airborne, you may have breathed it in. And I said, well, thank you very much, but I don't feel any ill effects from anything of that nature, so thanks anyway. Next day, I called up the Naval Archives and spoke to the clerk there and asked her if they had copies of my ship's records. And she put me on hold, came back. She says, oh, your records were pulled. I said, well, who and why would they pull my records, the ship's records? She says, well, they were pulled by the Atomic Energy Commission or some other agency, and they were investigating instances of radiation leakage of any ships that had nuclear weapons or nuclear powered. Mine had nuclear weapons on board. I said, this is wonderful. Yesterday I'm told I was exposed to Agent Orange. Today I'm being told I may suffer radiation poisoning. It's a wonder I'm not glowing orange at night. Well, as it happens, she found the records and she sent me my ship's deck log. So I have all of the records from the period in which we first reported to Subic Bay in the Philippines, which the ship berthed in Subic Bay, to the point of departure, December 31st, 1972, 12 midnight. We ceased firing. We headed straight for home. But that essentially is the basis of the book, and I tried to remain. This book recounts missions that the ship was involved in. It exposes some processes, some tactics that were really never really publicized during the course of the war. There was. I'll give you for example, we were stationed off of the DMZ. We were about 500 yards off of the coastline, and a place called Hanla Anchorage. The U.S. government had mined Haiphong Harbor and all of the major arteries going into North Vietnam to try to dispel the Chinese and the Russians from getting shipments into them, like equipment. Well, they used Hanla Anchorage as a means of distributing their staple goods to their troops ashore by trying to float rice bags. They would dump them in the water and let the tide carry them in. We happened to spot them, and we ultimately ended up picking up these rice bags and loading them on board ships to try to thwart the flow of supplies, albeit only rice. But, hungry soldier doesn't fight for long, I imagine. But so we would intercept him. Ultimately, he became too much of a chore because the decks were getting loaded. They were filling up the ship. So rather than take them on board, we would fire on them with 50 caliber machine guns or small arms fire and just sink them. Or we would call in actually an airstrike. And we would have an attack plane, a Navy attack plane, come down and strafe these bags as they floated along off the coast. That's one item that was never really publicized, made public here. Although my cruise yearbook happens to have an article pasted in it that appeared in the newspaper here about that. We also participated in PSYOPs missions, which, again, very little was made public about that. There was an EC-121, I think, is the designation of the plane, isn't it? It's an electronic aircraft that's used for jamming or for broadcasting radio and television signals. What the government did was prepare these fake broadcasts, and they made it seem as though it was being emanating from a counter-resurgency of the North Vietnamese government. They would just fly up along the coast and broadcast these radio programs and try to discourage the North Vietnamese from continuing to participate in the war. Well, our role in that PSYOPs mission was we were supplied with these radios, these transistor radios, that were in waterproof plastic floating bags, and we would have to run general quarters not only for our firing missions, but they also rated general quarters to do the PSYOPs drops, and we would have to pull in close to the North Vietnamese coastline, and toss these radios over the side and hope when they floated ashore that someone would pick it up. And it was only tuned to the single frequency that was being broadcast by the interceptor. So those are a couple of the disclosures that I make within the book that were really not that well publicized. It's also a travelogue. It just gives a description of Hong Kong, pretty vivid description of Hong Kong. We spent 7 days on our R&R in Hong Kong. Quite a dynamic city then, as it still is now. Give a little, there's a brief stay, well, not a brief stay, we stayed 19 days in Taiwan, but since it was a port that I didn't really care for, I didn't really divulge much time to it within the context of the book. A lot of it involves Subic Bay and the town of Olongapo. The character within the book who, and Christopher Columbus, by the way, is his name, and I named him Christopher Columbus because he was on who better than on somebody who's on a process of rediscovery. He's looking to find himself again. He lost his direction. His character had, he lost his focus on his destiny. There was a French poet, Jean de La Fontaine, who wrote, "Man often finds his destiny on the road traveled. Man often finds his destiny often on the road he travels to avoid it." In essence, that's what this character has done. He originally was going to be an aviator, a naval aviator. He was going college scholarship. He intended on getting wed, and he believed that was his destiny. Suddenly, that all came crumbling down. and he finds his destiny then in the service. I won't spoil the ending because you don't know exactly what his destiny is unless you read the book. That's basically pretty much it. I don't know. Do you have any questions? You want me to read something from it? Okay. We'll try that. This book is 12 chapters in length. 12 chapters? 12 chapters in length. And I'll give you...
I have a question.
Go ahead.
As long as I've been in the military, I've never heard of anyone getting drafted in the Navy, which I found very interesting because that's something I never knew.
Well, it
I knew
was known to happen.
I knew about them taking the first 10 guys in a row saying, hey, you're in the Marines. That's what happened the day I left. And but that's very interesting.
It was known to happen. If they needed manpower, but at that point in time, a lot of young men actually joined the Navy to avoid going into the
Right, you
Army.
couldn't join the Navy if you wanted to, like when I got drafted. You couldn't join the Navy if you had...
But if they were short more manpower, they would then commandeer some of these draftees.
Right.
I happened to be in a different circumstance. Well, this character was in a different circumstance. Well, we both were in a different circumstance. I went to college under the Navy ROTC scholarship.
Yeah.
Contractually, I could have left there when I finished my sophomore year, but I continued in the program one more semester, and as a result of that, I was obligated contractually to spend 2 years of active service with them, which is what this character has done.
Very interesting.
It's either that or Canada.
Yeah,
I like this country. I had no intention of leaving it.
absolutely.
Well, as I said, there are 11 chapters in this book. The first is called Bell Bottom Blues. The second is which explains how Chris Colombo came to become so despondent. The next is chapters in transit. Involves his travel from the States to the Philippines. Permission to come on board, sir, is chapter 3. That is when he first reports on board, and his first week in the port of Subic Bay. And then the next is the gun line. The gun line is the ship would Olongapo or Subic Bay was the port of replenishment, where the ship would report back to for repairs, also take on stores, and ammo, but also to get some respite for the crew as well. But the gun line was linebacker operations. Linebacker operations was support of troops of Quang Tri. Quang Tri is around Hue. There was an Easter offensive where the North Vietnamese seized Hue and seized Quang Tri. And linebacker operations were to support the Republic of South Vietnamese forces. We would provide gunfire support, and we would then, either by spotter fire or just grid firing. There was also a riverboat base at the Qua Viet River that we provided the fire support missions to. 30 days on the gun line. Not only were we involved with firing missions and called to general quarters quite often, was also the ship had to refuel. So periodically, every other third day, just about, we were underway. We had to pull alongside these oilers, these tankers, and pull the lines over and take on fuel. If not that, we would have to take on food stores. This crew consumed 250,000 pounds of food during this deployment over there. And then we also had to take on bullets. We needed shells and powder casings. This is a guided missile destroyer. Our armament was two 5.54 caliber guns, 5-inch guns. The shells weighed 70 pounds apiece. We also had a Tartar missile firing system, which was an anti-aircraft weapon. It was, and on midships was this thing called ASROC, anti-submarine rockets. Those were the nuclear-powered weapons. And we had torpedoes, 50 cal machine guns. But we never fired a missile. We never fired an ASROC. They never fired an ASROC. They just fired the 5-inch guns. We fired them so frequently that they ruined the bores and the muzzles on the guns. That's why when to Taiwan we had to swap out the guns and the bores for both mounts. Yes.
Can you share the story about how your discovery of the Agent Orange exposure helped some of your...
Oh, yeah, okay. We'll get to that. Then there's the return to Subic. Chris Colombo happens to meet a woman of the night. Actually, all sailors met women of the night when they visited a longer boat. She showed him a great deal of affection, a great deal of care. He started to develop feelings for this woman. But he was torn because he knew her profession. And although there were tales of a number of sailors and soldiers who, while overseas, meet women of that particular persuasion and profession, and they succumb to their charms, and they wed them. And many of these women deliberately tried to seduce these guys to fall in love with them so that they could get wed and leave the environment that they were in and come back to the States. And some of them may have been just honestly in love. Well, he meets this woman and they develop a relationship, and every time they return back to that port, he returns back to her. He doesn't butterfly. They call it butterfly. They had a terminology. There's a scene in the book where she tells him, "You know butterfly mean?" And Chris looks at Layla and he says, "What do you mean butterfly?" She says, "Butterfly." And she makes this motion with her hands, like she's flitting from flower to flower. And that's when he realizes what she meant. Then back on the line, and then there was the R&R in Hong Kong, is Chapter 7, and then there's Taiwan on, and then there's a thing called the DMZ, called Fire Up the Grid, and then there's a Chapter 10, Gang Banging in Subic Bay, it's called, which doesn't imply the sexual connotation. There was a racial issue going on in the service. And I make mention of that fact in this chapter. And then there's the last chapter is called Long Days and Short Timers. You were a short timer. You know what a short timer was? Sure. So, but one of our visitors here suggested I mention a story to you. I had mentioned earlier about obtaining the ship's deck logs from the Naval Archives. The ship happened to pull into Da Nang Harbor one day, and it's talked about in the book. We moored in the harbor. We sat there for about half a day. We had an officer who was on temporary active duty whom we had to pick up, and we also had to pick up mail. We ended up having to beat feet out of that harbor because it was determined that there were sappers working on the hull of the ship. So to discourage that, we were dropping concussion grenades over the side to prevent them from securing their mines against the ship's hull. And called back the personnel boat with our ensign on board and our ship's mail, and we got the heck out of there. Now, the reason I'm telling you about that aspect of the book is this whole book writing has been kind of a profound experience for me. It's managed to get me in touch with with a number of my old shipmates who I served with while I was there. I just so happened to receive a Christmas card in July from Shreveport, Louisiana. I don't know anybody in Shreveport, Louisiana, and I don't know who would be sending me a Christmas card in July. It turned out to be one of my crewmates who happened to learn about the book, read the book, was excited about it, and he put me in touch with a Facebook page for the USS Lawrence ex-crew members. I went on that. I joined that group and got back in touch with several of my other shipmates. One of which we started to talk on the phone, and I find out that he's got a number of ailments, cancer of the bladder. He has diabetes. He has a heart ailment, and several of those illnesses are evidently attributed to exposure to Agent Orange. He tells me that he's been fighting with the Disabled American Vets, DAV, for 4 years now to try to get Agent Orange benefits paid to him. But they tell him that their research, that they can't find any instances of this ship, the USS Lawrence, ever being in contaminated areas, which Da Nang, however, happened to be designated as. I said, well, I have the records, I have the ship's deck logs that show the date, times we were there, and the time we left. I'll send them to you. Well, I happened to email him those records, and I'm happy to say that the VA has approved him for Agent Orange exposure. So the one ancillary benefit to writing the book is that I was able to help somebody get a benefit that they deserved, rather than have the government try to cheat him out of his benefits. Turns out there were several others who were encountering the same issue that he did, and I sent them these records as well. What's going to happen with their cases, I can't say. I don't know, but I wish them the best, and I'll support them any way I can. Let me see if I can find a chapter, something that you might be interested in. You should be interested in the whole thing, actually. I'll have to warn you in advance. There's a fair amount of explicit sex and enough cursing in here to rival a battleship of sailors. That's what sailors did. That's what young men did thousands of miles away from the restraints of their parents and home. So the book is an honest appraisal and an honest picture of what life was like. I'll just read just a brief little snippet here. With supper finished, they emptied their trays at the scullery. Deal and Mazzarelli returned to the division's compartment, and Chris headed to the quarterdeck along with Diaz, Harriman, and Farley. They arrived at the quarterdeck at the sounding of 4 bells. Chris relieved Seaman Hill. Donning the white web belt with the nightstick holder, he assumed his watch, along with bosun mate First Class Mike Holcomb and Ensign Wellman from operations. Farley, Diaz, and Harriman departed down the gangway. Chris stood at the short dog watch, observing the crew as they headed off for the night of revelry and joking with many as they left. The quarterdeck watch was responsible for dispensing the proper military honors and ceremonies for boarding and deboarding the ship, validating identification, examining packages, and maintaining a quarterdeck log to record all drills and events deemed significant. So if you read this book, you're going to get a basic understanding of what shipboard life was like and what some of the areas of responsibility were. During the workday, the watch was busy as shore technicians and supply personnel was constantly coming and going. The dog watch was comparatively quiet as the amount of traffic was substantially less, so the watch provided an opportunity to shoot the breeze. Chris joked around with Petty Officer Holcomb, an affably gullible guy from Kentucky who would guffaw at wisecracks Chris would make about lifers and Navy life in general. Holcomb was himself a lifer who Chris thought should really take advantage of the Navy's free dental work, as his teeth were quite yellowed and sparse. Crew members would often humorously jibe and rank on each other. The focal points would center around the region of the country they hailed from, or on the individual's intelligence or sexuality and personal appearance. Chris would ask Holcomb things like, was it a problem for you to eat corn on the cob without front teeth? Or what model trailer was your old Kentucky home? Or what's it like to wipe your ass with corn cobs? Did your bathroom have a quarter moon cut out on the door? Holcomb would chortle, do a double take, and playfully swipe at him, punching him in the arm. Chris would not evade his jabs, letting him get restitution in some small way. Chris couldn't joke with the ensign in such a manner. His conversation with the officer was more serious. It goes on and on and on. But, maybe not one of the more interesting parts of the book. You know what life was like with other soldiers. You guys rank out on each other. Your mama jokes. Did you guys do your mama jokes? We have your mama jokes. A lot of your mama jokes in here.
No mercy. That's part of it.
There's a bunch of your mama jokes in here. But in essence, this is a tale of the USS Lawrence and its missions and accomplishments of the crew while there. And it takes place in a number of locations. The ship was engaged in battle in harbors in North Vietnam. There's a scene in here in the book which actually happened. I happen to be, as I said, this book is pretty much a historical memoir, and this character, Chris Colombo, is essentially me, and it's based on most of my experiences. And one of them happened to be we pulled into a place called Tiger Bay. It's called Hon Mat Island. In North Vietnam, and we had been there once before, and we got into a severe shelling match with an artillery installation that was located on the southern section of the island. It was, to give you an idea how close we were, our gun was firing point blank. We had no elevation on our gun whatsoever. So we were fairly close to one another. And I happened to be a TDT operator, and Chris Colombo's the TDT operator. And it's a night vision scope located on the signal bridge. Very powerful lens. And Chris happens, he actually observes that we had a designated firing targets, which the guns were firing upon, but we were receiving some heavy incoming fire, airbursts, and all around the ship. There were airbursts and splashes in the water, as close as 5 yards from the ship. We found quite a bit of shrapnel in the antenna arrays, as well as on deck. On deck, on the signal bridge, and miraculously, no one got hit. Fortunately, no one got hit. But this one particular night, when the ship was into Hamad Island, it was deadly quiet. There was no moon. Suddenly, the ship, as normally when we were on a mission, we would go run around 23 knots into the target area, target zone, firing zone, and then we would slow to 5 to 10 knots so the guns could get positioned and settled. Well, everything was running according to Hoyle, and we slowed down, but we slowed down to a point where the ship actually came to a halt. We were dead in the water. We lost boiler pressure. We were stuck between an island and the mainland of North Vietnam. We hadn't fired anything yet. And we're sitting there. I don't know how long the ship had been sitting there, half hour at least, before they tried to get boiler pressure up. And before we know it, the whole sky lit up above the ship. There were about 7 flares that were dropped from an aircraft, and it looked like a Christmas tree coming down. It was just circling around. And it was a very, very tense and scary moment. And it was amazing that they didn't see us, didn't fire upon us, and we managed to beat feet out of there without getting shot at. Chris Colombo and the crew here had it hard, but they never had it as hard as foot soldiers that were in country, and Chris always acknowledged that. He was very sympathetic with them. He had lost friends in the war. He had friends come home severely maimed. So he recognized the sacrifice they were making. He also recognized the sacrifice that sailors made. There's an incident in the book when they're sitting off the coast of Vietnam, and the Newport News is a cruiser. It's sitting about 200 yards off starboard beam of the ship, and we're all on firing missions. We're firing. The Newport News is firing. Now the Newport News has 16-inch guns. It's a huge cruiser. It's a big ship. Chris happened to be on watch at the starboard deck watch, starboard bridge watch, on the wing. And he's looking around. He's hearing the guns from Newport News go off, and suddenly he hears a noise that he doesn't recognize. It's not a gun firing. And he turns his binoculars to the Newport News, and he sees the damage control lights on. He hears the damage control bells going off, and he sees the emergency lights lit in the forward gun crew. As it happened, there was a premature detonation within the forward turret of that ship. It killed 19 sailors. So all of that is told in the book, folks. Do you have any other questions? Or
Did you lose any guys on your deployment?
we lost 1 to an overdose of drugs in Hong Kong.
Same thing.
But we,
You officer or enlisted?
well, that's the irony of the story. Chris was supposed to be an officer, but when he left the ROTC program, he lost that
Oh, okay.
designation. As a midshipman, you are considered almost warrant officer
Right.
rank. But when he left, he went in. That's the whole. His irony is that he could have been an officer in the Navy. He ends up going in as a lowly seaman, losing all the privileges that in rank provided. So the book provides perspective of the war from a sailor's point of view. I wrote the book because many of the well, for one, I thought it was an interesting story. It had a lot of elements. It had romance. It had comedy. It had tragedy. It had irony. There's a great deal of irony in this book. I thought it was.
Very interesting.
I thought it was like I said before. Ben Franklin said it better than I could. You either write something worth reading or you do something worth writing about. And here I thought I did two things. I thought this made an interesting story, as it hadn't been told before. Most of the books that you find on the Vietnam War involve Marines, infantry. Very little written about Blue Water Navy.
Right.
This is one of the few accounts that you'll find about the Blue Water Navy. I did my research, and most of the books that I found involved what they call brown water, river patrol boats. Or there would just happen to be reference books. And then I came across Olongapo Liberty, which happens to be a novel, but it takes place in the town of Olongapo. Anybody who's been through Olongapo, they all have the same experience. And that book, really, very good book. If you happen to get a chance, pick him up. He's a good read. But any sailor who went through that town knows what went on over there. Was it anything goes Liberty Town? There were opium dens. There were hundreds of bars that were every 10 feet. You couldn't trip, you'd fall into a bar. And bar girls everywhere. The wild, 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 wild town. But that's actually, you don't have to buy the book now. I told you the whole story.